To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded all of the textures from the Faux texture area on our Moodle page. Each of these is a different JPEG image of different kinds of textures we can apply to the surfaces that we're going to be rendering. Now to get started, let's jump into Photoshop and let's create a new document. We'll go up to File and down to New. The size of your document, once it decides to load up, is going to be 10 inches wide and 8 inches tall. Do make sure you're working in inches, and we don't need any extra artboards. Keep your resolution at 300 pixels per inch, and we'll work in RGB color mode. Now we do want to change the background color. From here, if you have it set to white, you can click on this and scroll down to choose Custom. This will pick up our custom color picker, and let's choose kind of a mid-tone of gray. I'm going to make mine slightly warmer by pulling it over to the red side. Yours doesn't have to do this, it's just something I like to do for this particular one. When we say OK, and then say OK to this, this will give us our document to work in. Now do make sure you have your color picker opened up, and we're going to be doing a lot of work in layers, so make sure your layers are also opened as well. In addition to this, make sure your tool panel is open so that we can see all of your basic drawing and selection tools. The first thing we want to do is to create 4 distinct circles that we can turn into spheres and place our textures onto. To do this, I'm going to go to my Layers panel, and let's create a new layer on top of my background layer. For now, we'll just call it Layer 1. With that layer selected, I'm going to choose my elliptical marquee tool. This is the one that will select in a circular area. And with this one, do make sure your feather is set to 0 pixels. This will give you a nice hard edge whenever we draw and create on it. With that, hold down the Shift key as you click and drag to create a perfect circle. Now we need to be able to fit 4 of these onto our page, so don't make it too big or too small, but just enough to be large enough to fill out the area. That looks pretty good for what we're going to do. With that entire area selected, let's fill it in with a solid color. I'm going to choose my paint bucket tool, and I'll go over and I'm just going to choose a basic, simple little mid-tone color. For now, it doesn't matter what color it is as long as you can see it. Later on, we can always go back and change this and make it whatever color that you want it to be. Once it's filled in, we can go up to Select and Deselect. Command D is the keyboard shortcut. To make copies of this, we're going to choose our Move tool, the little cross arrows at the top. We've got Layer 1 selected. If you hold down the Option key, when you click and drag, or if you're on a Windows, the Alt key, this will automatically make a copy of the layer. Let's make 2 more copies. Hold down Option or Alt, click and drag, make another copy, Option and Alt, and make another copy right there. From here, we can also hold down Shift and select all of our different circles, and you can see how that automatically picks up all the layers as well. And let's move them up and into position. If you need to, you can move these around or rescale them, change up the size, whatever you need to for this, but I think this will be okay for what we're trying to do for this document. Now we only want to work on this 1 circle at a time, so I'm not going to worry about all 3 of these being visible. Let's go down to our layers. Let's turn off visibility for all those copies that we created. Select Layer 1, and we'll only work in this layer for now. Now with that layer selected, I want to change the color of this particular shape, or everything that's actually on this layer. Since it's made up of pixels, one easy way to do that is go up to Image, down to Adjustments, and we're going to use our Hue and Saturation adjustment to change up the color of this. With the Hue and Saturation, it gives you a little picker, and this will allow you to click on the little hue shifter and drag it over to change it to whatever color hue you want it to be. You can also play around with the brightness of it or the saturation, and make it lighter or darker to dial in exactly the tone that you want to be from here. Do make sure that preview is turned on so that you can see those changes be applied. Now one thing I want you to notice is don't pay too close attention to the hue that's on here. Right now you can see it's pointing to blue, but it's still kind of a yellowy orange. If I was moving over to green, that turns it into more of a red, so on and so forth from here. If you do want it to be more accurate and actually colorize everything that's on there and selected, you can choose Colorize. Now this will take whatever tone that you have and make it exactly what you want it to be. So I can pull my saturation, lightness, and darkness up and turn it directly into that particular color. What I want you to do is to take this color and let's turn it into a red circle. We'll make mine a little bit more contrasting. But as long as it's red and I can see it, that's what we want it to be. From here I can say OK, and that will lock in, and you can see how it changes the entire look and feel of everything that was on that layer. From here, let's go in and paint some highlights and shadows and turn this into a basic sphere. So I'm going to go to my Layers panel. I'm going to lock down the transparency of layer 1, grab my brush tool, and the only brush that I need to work with is just this basic soft round brush. Now the size of it does kind of matter. We don't want it to be too small or too large, but a larger brush tends to work out better. So for this one, around 350 to 400 pixels tends to be a good size brush. Also, we can play around with the flow or the opacity to slightly blend in our highlights and shadows. I'm going to hold down the Option key. That's going to pick up this particular tone of red. Then I can go over to my color picker. Let's get a shade of red and paint that shade in on one side and get it to blend in with everything else. Once you get your shadows established, let's focus in on those midtones as well. Then we can go back over to our color picker, pick a good highlight. Let's give it a highlight edge up here at the top. Again, keep it working it back and forth until you finally pick up the look and feel that you want for your basic shade. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect. Later on, we're going to go back in and make this look even more better. All right, now let's apply a texture to this overall surface. In order to do this, let's place one of those rock textures that we've applied to here. So I'm going to go up to File, down to Place Embedded, and let's locate the folder that has all of my textures inside of them. So here's my faux texture. Select the rock texture. This is the one that looks like kind of a granite or marble type texture. When you say Place, it's going to want to bring this in as a smart object. So for now, you can scale this down. And let's scale it down so it's just large enough to fill over the entire surface of my sphere. So I want it to cover it up completely. Now because it's an embedded one, we need to check it off to submit that change. And you can see in our Layers panel that it adds that rock texture on top of layer 1. Now the magic trick that we're going to perform here is to get this texture to only be applied inside of the pixels of our sphere. To do this, we're going to create a clipping mask. Go up to go to Layer, and go down to Create Clipping Mask. The keyboard shortcut for this one is Option Command G, or Alt Command G if you're on a Windows. When you do that, you can see now that all the edges of that are clipped inside of the edges of my sphere. And check out our Layers panel. There's a little arrow that points down to the object that it's clipping into. So in this case, the rock texture only shows up if there's pixels inside of my little sphere layer on layer 1. From here, now let's see if we can see some of the color of the sphere below it. With the rock texture layer still selected, change your blending mode from normal down to overlay. With overlay, this will allow you to pick up on some of your highlights and even shadows along this particular edge. And it does a pretty good job of being able to see everything that's behind it and on top of it. Now, I can still play around with the opacity of this layer, making it more or less opaque, so I can bring out or in that particular texture. Or if I kept it at 100%, I still need to go back in and add some shadow and highlight to that texture as well. To do this, we need to add more layers on top of the layer that we already have. So let's go to our Layers panel one more time. We're going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this my Shadows layer. And we want those shadows to also stay inside of my, my sphere area too. Here's a good keyboard shortcut. Hold down the Option key and click between your two different layers. Notice that the cursor will turn into the little arrow, and when you click, it'll automatically turn that into a clipping mask. Now everything that's on top of here is going to be clipped inside of this area. From here, I can grab my brush tool. Let's set it to be a dark, dark red. Let's paint on some more shadows on top of our textured area. So that looks pretty good for it there. Even within here, since these are shadows and we want those darker areas to blend in, let's change the blending mode now from normal to multiply, and that will let the shadows show up even better from here. If you need to lighten it up, you can either paint on a lighter color, or you can go back in with your eraser tool and erase it away. So in this case, I'm painting white, and that will fix any shadows that don't show up. Now, if I want to do highlights, I need to make another layer on top of this one. Again, hold down Option and click between the two layers. Call this highlights. And for here, we're going to choose the white as our color, and we can dial in and paint in some white for that highlight. Now, I could keep it like that, or I can go in, and to pick up the lighter colors, I can set this to be screen. On any one of these, if you think the highlight or the shadows or even the texture is too much, this is where you go in and play with the opacity of it. For instance, I think the highlight that I've created here is a little bit too bright, so maybe I'll knock the opacity of this layer down just a bit so I can see that texture. And I can even do the same for the shadows if I think the shadows are too dark with that. Now I've got a textured sphere ball that was easily and quickly rendered. So if you ever have anything that's very, very textured, rather than going in and having to draw off every single detail about it and it still won't look correct and you'll spend hours trying to make it look right, go in and find a texture and apply it to that particular area. Once we're done with this, now we can go in, let's clean up our layers. Let's put everything in here in one particular folder. Select the topmost layer, hold down Shift and get all the way down to your sphere, and then we'll put it inside of a folder or a group. Let's call this one Rock Texture. From there, everything inside of that rock texture is now saved up with this one. Let's do the same thing with another texture. We'll go down to our second layer and turn on that copy. For this one, I want to apply a rust to this particular layer. Now I'm going to change up the color of this one more time. We'll go up to Image, down to Adjustments, and choose your Hue and Saturation. And let's make this kind of a bluish color. So I'm going to choose Colorize and bring it over into the blue spectrum. A little bit more saturated, maybe a little bit right about there. We'll say OK to that. As we did with the other ones, we can return to our Layers panel, turn on your Transparency lock, grab your paintbrush tool, and select that blue. So now I can go in and start to paint on some highlights and shadows. With that done, let's bring on our texture. Again, File, Place Embedded. Let's find the rust texture and say Place. And again, we'll scale it down to get exactly what we want from here. You can hit the checkbox or return to lock in that transformation. And with the rust texture selected, let's go up to Layer and create a clipping mask amongst it. Another advantage of using a clipping mask is that because it's on its own layer, you can also move this around, because if you see part of a texture that you want to keep, you can always add that in there as well. For instance, I really like the darker edge on this one and the highlight lighter edge up to here, so I'll just move this over till I get the edge and the contours that I like. Now with this one, if I was to choose Overlay, it's also going to change up the color, and I don't want it to be this greenish color. I really want to keep it nice and blue. So I'm going to keep it at normal for now, and with this option selected, let's go up to Image and Adjustments And let's do the hue and saturation adjustment for this texture. Again, make sure colorize is turned on. It remembers that I had blue selected last time, so it automatically turns it to blue. And I can dial in the exact texture, or excuse me, the exact hue, saturation, lightness, and darkness that I want until I get the area that I like. Now I can say OK. And with that dialed in, check this out. At the very bottom of our layers panel, because it came in as a smart object, it's now a smart object filter. This means if I need to make an adjustment to this, if I want to change up the color again, all I've got to do is double click on the hue and saturation layer here. This will bring this up and it'll allow me to make an adjustment further to it as well. Now with that selected, I can close that out. We can set this to overlay, and this gives us the texture that we need for this particular object as well. From here, we can go back in as we did with the other ones and tweak the highlights and shadows to getting it look like a nice perfect form. For me, I'm going to drop down the opacity just a bit so that it's not so stark with it. Now I can go in, create a new layer. This will be my shadows layer. Grab my paintbrush tool and choose a darker blue and clean up some of the shadows that are inside of here. Now since those shadows are darker, we're going to set this layer mode to be multiply. And even with this one, we can drop the opacity down until we get it exactly where we want it to be for this. That's looking pretty good. Let's make a new layer on top of it. Hold down Option or Alt. This will be my highlights. And in this layer is where we'll paint our lighter blue. Just a touch to make it look the same for there. Again, adjusting the opacity if necessary until you get the texture as you need. So for this one, the main thing to remember is if you ever get a texture that's not the color of what you want it to be, simply alter the color of that texture by using that level adjustments, or that hue and saturation adjustment, excuse me. Finally, let's clean this up by putting all of these into a folder. Select this one, hold down Shift, and select all of those. Click once on the folder, and we'll call this the Rust texture. Now let's turn on our third one and apply another texture to this one. Let's have some fun with this one. I'm going to make this one into more of a dragon skin. So with that layer selected, we'll go up to the adjustments, choose hue and saturation. And for this one, let's turn it into more of a greenish type color. Again, I want to keep it a midtone. And we'll make it a little less saturated, something like that. That looks good. And say OK. Go to our layers panel, lock down the transparency of it, grab our paintbrush, hold down Option to select this particular tint of green, and let's add on the shadows for this one. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger so it'll go faster. Just a couple of swipes, and I've got it set. Go back up to my highlights. There it is right there. All right, once we've got our sphere set, now let's place our texture. We'll go up to File, Place Embedded. We'll choose the skin texture for this one. Say Place, and then we'll scale this down and lock it in. Hit Return or Alt for that. Now, one unique challenge for this one is to pay attention to the direction of the light for your texture. On my sphere, I've got my light kind of coming directly on in this upper right-hand side, but the light on this one is coming almost directly on top. So as I place my texture on top of this sphere, we'll turn on our clipping mask, create a clipping mask. You may need to rotate your texture so that the highlights and the shadows match up the same direction as the object you're painting on. In this case, the highlights are now in this upper right-hand corner and the shadows are matching the lower left-hand corner. With that, I'll hit Return. Then we can go up to Image, adjustments. Let's do the hue and saturation for this one as well. Again, colorize. This will turn it a nice deep shade of green. We'll make mine a little more pale, maybe slightly darker. We'll say OK to that. Now with it selected, let's change our blending mode for the layer down to overlay. And you can see it's starting to get there, but still not 100%. For this one, let's also play around with the opacity and drop it down just a bit more to get it to show up right where I want. Now, when I do this and drop the opacity, I'm also losing a lot of the details within the crevices and the highlights for this design. So what I want to do is to go back in and really repaint and show what the texture can be pushed to. To do this, with that skin layer still selected, let's go up to Image and Adjustments. And this time we're going to adjust the exposure for this unit. With the exposure set, now I can dial in and correct any of the highlights and shadows and really push that out. So if I made my exposure lighter, you can see it gets rid of all of those parts. That brings that back. And the gamma correction is what really pushes that texture more or less. Now this is the kind of thing that you just play around with to be able to see. You can offset it just a bit until you get that texture showing up the way you looks a little bit more natural. I think for mine, we're just going to tweak it just a bit more, really push that texture. Those darks are showing up with that gamma correction for there. Now when I pull that in, that shows up much better, and I can even drop the opacity more if I wanted to. We just want it to be nice and subtle enough without overwhelming everything that we have. Let's take it a little bit of a step farther. So as we did with the other ones, notice that you've got two different smart filters, so if you need to go back and adjust the exposure or the hue and saturation, you can from here. I'm going to close those out. Let's make our new layer. This will be our shadow layer on top of this. Grab my paintbrush. Again, let's load up a darker green. Add a few shadows to that edge. Maybe knock down the opacity of that just a bit more. There we go, push it back. And also change that layer to be multiply. And let's make another layer on top of this as we've done before. This will be my highlights. We'll set that mode to be screen. And let's choose a lighter green just to have a hit for this one. Now, since this is a more of a textured type thing, it doesn't have to have so much highlight in one particular area. Instead, we want to be able to go in and correct some of the highlights that are already on the skin texture, because if this was light hitting it, it wouldn't just fall on one area, it would actually hit all of the little nooks and crannies and crevices along this area. So let's go back in with our brush now and fix some of those smaller areas. I'm going to zoom into this one so I can see the entire thing. I'm going to create one more layer on top of this one. I'm just going to call this my details layer. To be honest, the name of it doesn't really matter, but on this layer, this is where I'm going to go back in and actually add whatever highlight and shadow details that I may have lost. Now with my brush that I've selected, I've got just a really small sized brush now, about 10 pixels, something just large enough so I can paint within these areas. And I've got my pressure sensitivity turned on for this as well. My flow is down pretty low, so I can build up this particular color. And the color that I'm going to be adding back to it is going to be this highlight of green. From here, I can go into any of these little nooks and crannies and start to paint back on these highlights. Now this is the kind of thing that you don't want to overdo, but you want to have more highlights the closer it is to the main spot, and then fewer as it goes out. So this is the kind of thing just to be real careful with. But as I go in and paint, this will add in a few more highlights just along that highlight edge. Doing this is what really makes your overall image pop. It's all about that tonal value and having a good range of lights and darks and not losing that within the figure that you're painting. With that done, let's back out and see what we've got. Now it's starting to look like a really good glossy texture that's on your entire area. Adding back in those details really helps. The final thing we need to do is to clean up along the edges of our illustration. This way it doesn't look like a smooth ball. Instead, we want to be able to see some of the bumps and peaks and ridges that are naturally forming along the texture of this particular animal. So to do that, we need to return to our layers, and let's go down to our original sphere layer. From here, this is where we can erase away the overall shape of the ball so that it can add that texture in. So with that done, I'm going to unlock my transparency, grab my eraser tool, and with the eraser, let's make sure we're working with a hard edge, just regular round brush. The size of it can vary up depending on how much we want, but in general, we're going to keep this size of the brush relatively small. And I'm going to turn on my pressure sensitivity so I can see this. Now when I zoom in, let's go around the edges and nibble away at it so that it looks like it has a good texture to it. Can go in with this. Again, make sure the layer is selected. Because we're nibbling away at the edge of this, this will also pick up on any textures, highlights and shadows that we have. And I'm really paying close attention to where the divots would be within this area. So take your time, zoom in if you have to so that you can really see the area that you're working on, but don't eat away too much. You just want to give it a simple faux kind of look with that texture. That actually looks pretty good with that. All right, and now we're done with that. It looks like it has a good highlighted texture that goes all the way around the ball, and the ball itself is no longer smooth because the outline profile is no longer smooth as well. If we back out, we can view it along with all of the others. And the last thing we need to do for this texture is, of course, group them all into one folder. So selecting from the details, holding Shift, all the way down to your layer copy, let's put it inside of a folder. We'll call this the skin texture. Finally, let's turn on the last circle, and we'll let this be that wooden texture that we created. With it selected, again, let's go up to Adjustments and open up your Hue and Saturation, and we'll colorize this one to be more of a brownish type color. Remember, brown is a shade of red, so if you need to make a brown, go into your reds or your oranges in order to get that particular tone for this one. That'll be okay for what we're going to work on. Maybe a little less saturated. I think that'll be okay with that. We'll say okay. As we've done with the others, go to your layer and turn on your transparency lock. Grab your brush tool. I'll make my brush large again, so using my bracket keys to make it much, much larger. And also making sure that I work in a good opacity. Hold down Option to pick up that particular part of brown. Then you can go in and grab a shade of brown. Very quickly, let's give it a shadow edge. And then go back up. Let's give this a bit of a highlight spot as well. Just a couple of clicks was easily able to make that. From here, let's load on that last texture. Go up to File, Place Embedded, choose the wood texture and say Place, and then we'll scale this down to fit it as well. As we did with the others, we also want to colorize this so that the colors relatively match the tones that we have for this one. So with the wood texture selected, we'll go to Image and Adjustments and adjust that hue and saturation. And we'll choose Colorize to match up that particular tones for that one as well, and say OK to this. Finally, place the texture right on top. Whoops. Transform it up. There we go. Right on top of that so that it fits. And let's turn on our clipping mask. We'll turn off that, hold down Option, and click between those to mask it into here. Now, the unique problem with this texture is that it doesn't look like it's wrapping around a sphere. We were able to get away with this in the other textures simply because these other textures really didn't have any point of reference. But for this texture, since all of the textures are going vertical, it doesn't look like it's really spherized or contorting around that particular area. So what we want to do with this is to be able to warp it so that we can see exactly, have all of this picture warped along the edges of our sphere as well. Now to do this, I'm actually going to undo the clipping mask we created. So holding down Option again and clicking, I want to be able to see the entire area before we clip this in there. Let's go up to Edit, down to Transform, and we want to do a warp distortion or a warp transformation. With warp turned on, we'll say OK to this. It'll turn off your smart object layers or that color adjustment. That's what I'm trying to say for now. But this will allow us to click on this and drag it around and actually warp it into a more spherical kind of setting. Now when we click on the edges, you can see it brings this in. This gives us our little Bezier handle, so I can move this up. And what I want to do is to bring this as close as I can to the edge of my sphere and then try to spherize this as best as possible. Now it's not going to be 100% perfect, but that's okay. I'm just going to bring it in and do the best I can with what I've got. But you can see now how this is really starting to wrap around one edge and the other. And doing this kind of warp little technique comes in handy for placing your textures on areas that aren't flat, but actually curve in 3 dimensions. So you want to be able to have your textures have a curve as well. Now it's a little bit difficult to see on this one, but there's also some lines on the inside of this edge as well. And I can click on those lines on the inside of this and actually drag it out and push those to the edge and then really bulge out the center point of this texture too. Now check out the look and feel of our texture. Because it's going in a spherical fashion, it looks more natural and it looks like it should fit inside of a circle or a sphere that we've created. Again, yours doesn't have to look 100% perfect. It's just meant to be kind of the overall look of it. Once you've got the settings that you like, to lock it in, hit the check at the top. Now that it's locked in, we can go back in and turn on our clipping mask, and now it looks like it's more spherical. As we've done with the others, let's play around with the blending modes and even the exposure of this as well. So with that texture selected, let's change the blending mode. Multiply is a little too much. Screen, of course, doesn't work, but overlay tends to work best. So my layer blending mode is set to overlay. We'll go up to image and adjustments, and let's adjust the exposure of this. The exposure set, we can play around with how much we want that texture to show up. We can offset it to really push the bite of it, or bring it back down to have it be just a little bit of texture. Excuse me, that's a gamma correction. The offset's going to make it lighter or darker. And we'll say OK to that. And if I think that's too much, I can always drop the opacity of it down just a little bit more to dial in what I want. Maybe about 20 is too much. About 80 to 90%, somewhere in between there tends to work out good for this. Now that we've got that established, let's go back in. I'm going to add a shadow layer. And let's fix and add a few darker shadows into this area. With that selected, we'll choose a darker brown. Go in and paint on a shadow. Set that blending mode to be multiply so that it shows up really, really well from there as well. Now, since this is a wooden texture, I don't necessarily want it to have too much of a highlight on that edge. So I'm not going to do a lot more on adding highlights, but I do need to add a few details so that I can brighten up some parts of this, just like we did with the skin. So with that done, we'll go back down. I'm going to add not a highlight layer, but let's do a details layer. I've still got my brush selected. I'm going to go up and make it much, much smaller. Yeah, around 15 to 20 pixels. And from here, I want to add in some of these highlights and midtones from here. So I really like this kind of yellow look. Let's go in, zoom in, and add some of those details to this overall texture. Remember, don't get too far into the shadows when you do this. Just stay within that mid-tone range and get less and less as you do move out away from your main source of your light. With that done, now let's go around and clean up the outer contour of our ball so that it matches the rough texture that's underneath it. Again, choose your layer that you've copied, turn off the transparency mask, and let's grab our eraser tool, and then slowly go around and nibble away at the edge, paying close attention to where those peaks and valleys are along this particular area. All right, with that done, you can see how it really does add a lot of texture and character to the overall look and feel. It feels like it's fully spherical. Now, the last thing that we're going to do for this particular texture is apply a secondary light source. And this is just an extra little thing. You don't have to do it for everything that you do, but it's one way of adding an extra dimension of believability to your overall painting. By a secondary light source, what I mean is, instead of having the main light source being here in the center, let's imagine there was another, maybe even a different color light coming off to the other edge. Now to do this, let's grab our paintbrush tool, and we're going to choose a color that's either analogous or complementary to the color that we have on this. In my case, I think it would look better if I had kind of a shade or a highlight of blue. Now, I'm not going to go too highlight with this, so I don't want it to be closer to white. I really want it to be more closer to a mid-tone or a higher key style of blue for this one. But a blue is a good complementary to these golden yellows that we have. Now, make sure you're working on your details layer, because in these details, just like we added the highlights to this area, we want to add these extra highlights to your shadow edge on the the left-hand side of this ball. Now I'm going to zoom in. We don't need to add a lot of them, but as it moves from the left hand side into the center, getting closer to this highlight, we want it to become fewer and fewer. So if I was to paint this, maybe I would have a blue highlight showing up along this edge. Another thing I'm looking for is I want to add these highlights right along where the rim of one little edge would be. So I'm going to be breaking this up, painting in just a small portion at a time, and then adding more and more, and then fewer as it moves along. But this edge needs to have the most highlights to it. Now notice as I did this, I tried to follow along and mimic the texture of whatever object that I'm drawing, in this case the texture of the wood. If you need to, you can always go back in with your eraser tool and knock it down just a bit, but also pay attention that you've got more details closer to the light source, and then it fades out as it goes along the entire folds of your design. We'll actually grab my brush tool. I'm going to knock the opacity down to about 10% and make these a little less opaque, a little less noticeable from there. Now that I've got two tones on it, let's back out and see all the different textures that we've created. This is looking really, really good. With those done, let's go back to our layers panel and let's group together all of these different as well. Holding Shift, selecting all four of those and putting them inside of a group folder, and this will be our wood texture. Now that we're finished with this, let's go up to File and Save As. Make sure to add your name to this document, and you can call it Texture Practice. Whoops, there we go, P-R-A-C-T-I-C, there we go. And the file format that it needs to be saved in will be a Photoshop file, so I can have all of your layers that are a part of this as well. When you hit save, this document may be rather large, so make sure when you upload it to Moodle, if it doesn't work, you could email it to me or send it to me as a Google Drive link.